Tonight, before you fall asleep, there is something important you need to understand about why your energy feels drained, even when nothing seems wrong, why your mind feels noisy, even in moments of silence, and why clarity appears briefly and then fades again. This is not weakness, it is not lack of faith, and it is not accidental. For centuries, people were taught that spiritual struggle is abstract, distant, and only solvable through belief, obedience, and ritual. But what was quietly removed from early teachings was something far more practical, because Jesus did not only teach belief, he taught methods that worked regardless of emotion, regardless of mood, and regardless of institutional permission. Those methods were never meant for crowds, they were never meant for systems of control. They were shared privately with those who were ready to apply them rather than worship them. Early suppressed writings describe a reality where spiritual interference is not defeated through effort or repetition, but through alignment, through frequency, and through physical anchors that operate continuously without requiring constant focus or discipline. This is the part that terrified power structures, because once protection becomes simple, authority becomes unnecessary, and once clarity becomes accessible, fear loses its leverage. Most people today are taught to pray harder when confusion increases, to endure longer when pressure intensifies, and to submit more deeply when clarity disappears. But none of that addresses the mechanism of interference, because interference does not argue with belief, it exploits distraction fatigue, emotional instability, and weakened perception. It thrives when awareness is fragmented and when identity is unstable. Jesus understood this, and that is why what he revealed privately was not symbolic, not ceremonial, and not dependent on institutions. It was functional. He revealed that certain physical objects, when carried or created intentionally, anchor a frequency predatory, non-physical forces cannot tolerate. And when that frequency is present, interference does not negotiate it. Withdraws immediately, not gradually, not over weeks. Instantly. This knowledge was buried for over 17 centuries. Labeled heresy, myth, or metaphor, not because it was vague, but because it was precise. Tonight, you are not being asked to believe anything new. You are being invited to remember something very old, something simple, and something effective. You are about to understand why confusion suddenly lifts for some people, why certain homes feel heavy, while others feel calm, and why some individuals seem impossible to manipulate, no matter the pressure applied to them. This is not about religion, it is about function, and once you understand how it works, you will begin to recognize it everywhere, because the first thing interference always attacks is perception, and restoring perception changes everything. Asterisk perception is always the first target, because a human who perceives clearly cannot be guided, manipulated, or drained without resistance. And this is why interference never begins with fear or pain. It begins with distraction, mental noise, and subtle confusion that slowly feels normal. Over time, when perception weakens, reality becomes harder to interpret and easier to distort. Decisions feel heavier, intuition feels unreliable, and the inner voice that once guided you becomes quieter, not because it disappeared, but because the signal is being drowned out. Most people assume this state is stress or personality or fatigue, but ancient teachings understood it as narrowing of awareness. When awareness narrows, external influence gains leverage, and suggestion becomes stronger than inner knowing. This is how control operates, invisibly, not through force, but through uncertainty, because uncertainty weakens the will more effectively than fear ever could. When the mind is flooded with competing signals, intuition fades, not because it is gone, but because it is buried beneath noise. This noise comes from constant stimulation, emotional pressure, unresolved tension, and unexamined thoughts that repeat themselves until they feel like truth. Once perception is compromised, people stop trusting themselves and begin outsourcing clarity to external voices, opinions, systems, and authorities. This is the real prison, not physical limitation, but internal confusion that feels personal when it is not. Jesus understood that restoring perception had to come first, because without perception, no teaching can be applied correctly. And no truth can be recognized even if it is spoken aloud. This is why what he revealed privately focused on restoring the natural signal the body and mind recognize as coherence, not through effort, not through discipline, but through alignment. When perception returns, manipulation becomes obvious, emotional hooks lose power, and interference has nowhere to hide. This is why restoring perception terrifies predatory forces, because once you can see how influence enters your thoughts, you stop identifying with it, and once you stop identifying with it, you stop obeying it. This is the moment clarity begins to stabilize. And this is where the first object comes in, not as belief, not as decoration, but as a functional stabilizer that reintroduces coherence into the system and prepares perception to reopen safely and consistently, without forcing, without strain, without dependence. The first object was introduced not as a symbol to admire, but as a stabilizing reference, because perception does not reopen through effort, it reopens through resonance. Ancient civilizations understood that certain natural materials carry stable frequencies that the human nervous system recognizes immediately, not intellectually, but biologically. When the body encounters a familiar coherent signal, it begins correcting itself automatically, without force, without belief, and without conscious control. This is why the first object was never framed as protection through battle, but protection through clarity. Long-term interference does not feel dramatic, it feels like fog, muted intuition, scattered focus, and a constant sense of being slightly disconnected from yourself. This state becomes normal because it develops slowly, and once it feels normal, it stops being questioned. The centers responsible for higher perception are especially sensitive to this kind of interference when they are overstimulated with noise, emotional pressure, and constant tension. Perception collapses, inward awareness narrows, and external influence gains leverage. This is where the first object becomes critical, because it does not fight interference, it outpaces it. It introduces a coherent frequency that the system recognizes as truth and begins aligning toward naturally. This object works quietly, continuously, and without effort, because it does not require you to focus on it or believe in it. It simply remains present, providing a reference signal that your perception centers can lock onto. Over time, this produces subtle but undeniable changes. Thoughts feel clearer, inner noise loses intensity, intuition becomes sharper, and awareness begins separating what originates from you versus what is not. This differentiation is everything, because interference relies on invisibility. Once a thought or emotional impulse becomes observable, it loses authority. This is why the first object was carried constantly. Not during rituals, not occasionally, but daily, because consistency trains perception. After sustained exposure, clarity stops being something you visit and becomes something you inhabit. Confusion no longer sticks, manipulation loses traction, and awareness begins operating as your baseline state. This is why the first object was always taught before anything else, because without restored perception, no other method can function correctly, and once perception is restored, the entire dynamic of influence changes quietly but permanently. The second object becomes necessary once perception begins to reopen, because clarity without stability is fragile, and pressure always tests identity before it tests belief. When awareness sharpens, interference shifts tactics. It no longer tries to blind you, it tries to destabilize you by introducing doubt, hesitation, and internal contradiction. This is how clarity collapses, not by force, but by erosion. Without a stable sense of identity, perception flickers under stress, dissolves under emotional pressure, and disappears when challenged. Ancient teachings understood that perception shows you what is happening, but identity determines whether you act with authority or retreat into uncertainty. This is why this second object was never about vision, it was about anchoring truth into physical form, so it could not be negotiated away. Spoken declarations inspire, but they fade. Written anchoring stabilizes, because what is written remains present, broadcasting continuously without requiring repetition, confidence, or emotional strength. This is why early initiates treated writing as technology, Not art, not philosophy, but a method for fixing identity in material reality. When identity is anchored physically, it becomes difficult to destabilize. Psychologically, interference relies on making you forget who you are in moments of pressure. The second object removes that leverage because it does not depend on mood or discipline. It remains active when you are tired, distracted, or emotionally charged. This is why those who anchor identity experience a sudden reduction in mental noise. Decisions feel simpler, not because life becomes easier, but because internal conflict stops sabotaging clarity. Hesitation fades. When identity is no longer negotiable, this object does not fight interference. It renders interference ineffective. It announces alignment continuously, and anything that cannot operate in the presence of that alignment withdraws automatically. When identity stabilizes, clarity holds, and when clarity holds, interference loses access. This is why the second object is foundational. Without it, perception becomes temporary. With it, perception becomes consistent, and daily pressure loses its grip. Asterisk, what most people do not realize is that identity is attacked every single day in ways so subtle they feel personal rather than external. It shows up as second-guessing your own decisions, doubting your instincts, feeling guilty for asserting yourself, and hesitating when clarity is already present. This erosion does not happen all at once. It happens through repetition until uncertainty feels like humility and hesitation feels like wisdom. Interference depends on this confusion because a person who does not trust their own authority will always defer to something outside themselves even when they are already perceiving the truth. This is why identity anchoring is not optional. Once perception reopens without anchoring identity, pressure will always find a way back in through emotion, fatigue, or conflict. Ancient teachings understood that the mind under pressure defaults to what is most stable, not what is most true. If identity is not stabilized, clarity collapses during stress and returns only when things are calm. This creates a cycle where awareness feels unreliable when in reality, it is simply unsupported. The second object exists to break this cycle by fixing identity in physical form, so it does not fluctuate with emotion or circumstance. When identity is anchored externally, it stops being negotiable internally. This produces a very specific effect that many people describe without understanding it. Decisions feel quieter. There is less internal debate, less emotional turbulence, and less mental justification required to act because action no longer requires internal permission. It flows from recognition. Interference attempts to re-enter through urgency, distraction, and emotional hooks, but these attempts fail because the signal they rely on is no longer present. This is why people who stabilize identity notice that pressure loses its intensity. Situations that once felt overwhelming now feel manageable, not because life changed, but because leverage disappeared. The internal environment became stable. This stability is deeply threatening to any system that relies on reaction, because reaction requires instability. Once reaction is gone, manipulation loses timing, and without timing, influence collapses. This is why the second object is not about empowerment in the emotional sense. It is about grounding authority into something that does not move, something that does not argue, something that does not need reinforcement. It simply remains present, broadcasting alignment continuously and silently. And as long as that signal is present, interference has nowhere to attach, no opening to exploit, and no confusion to amplify. Asterisk, this is why many people feel strong for a moment after a realization, and then feel pulled back into old patterns days later, because realization without stabilization fades under pressure, and pressure is constant in daily life. It comes from responsibilities, relationships, expectations, and internal narratives that never fully stop. Interference understands this rhythm and waits patiently for moments of fatigue, because fatigue weakens internal coherence. When you are tired, you revert to defaults, and if identity has not been anchored, the default becomes doubt, hesitation, and self-questioning. This is not failure, it is mechanics. Ancient teachings never blamed the individual for this. They designed methods that work even when the individual Was exhausted, distracted, or emotionally charged, the second object functions precisely here. It does not require you to remember who you are in every moment. It remembers for you. This is critical because most people lose clarity, not when things are calm, but when they are overwhelmed. The anchored identity holds steady when the mind cannot. It keeps broadcasting the same signal, regardless of mood, stress, or circumstance. This produces a gradual but profound shift over time. Reactions slow down not because you suppress them, but because they lose urgency. Emotional spikes still appear, but they no longer hijack behavior. Intrusive thoughts still arise, but they are recognized as transient rather than authoritative. This recognition creates space, and space creates choice. Most people have never experienced sustained choice because their internal environment has always been reactive. This is why anchored identity feels unfamiliar at first. Quieter, less dramatic, more grounded. It does not create emotional highs, it creates stability, and stability allows perception to deepen without collapse. As days pass, something subtle becomes noticeable. You stop explaining yourself internally. You stop rehearsing arguments. You stop justifying decisions before making them. Action becomes simpler because it no longer needs internal debate. This is not arrogance, it is alignment, and alignment removes friction. Interference attempts to adapt by increasing noise, urgency, or emotional charge. But without instability, these tactics fail. They slide off rather than stick. This is why anchored identity changes not just how you think, but how situations unfold around you. Interactions become shorter, conflicts lose momentum, and draining dynamics quietly dissolve because the internal signal they relied on is no longer available. This is the hidden effect. Most people do not anticipate external circumstances, respond to internal stability, not through magic, but through feedback loops. When you stop reacting, others lose leverage. When you stop doubting, others stop pushing. When you stop feeding confusion, confusion stops visiting. This is not because the world changed, but because the entry points closed. And once those entry points close, consistently something larger becomes possible. Not just personal stability, but environmental coherence. The space around you begins to reflect the state within you. And this is where the third object eventually becomes relevant, not yet as a new step, but as a natural extension. Because once identity stabilizes, the next vulnerability is not internal, but environmental, and interference always looks for the next opening. The reason interference eventually shifts from attacking the individual to attacking the environment is simple. Once internal reactions stop feeding it, the external conditions become the only remaining access point. Most people never notice this transition because they assume changes in atmosphere, mood, or comfort are random, but environments carry memory patterns and emotional residue that can amplify or suppress coherence. When identity stabilizes, the individual becomes harder to influence directly, so pressure begins to appear indirectly through spaces, sleep quality, tension in the home, unexplained heaviness or restlessness. These are not psychological coincidences. They are environmental feedback loops responding to internal stability. When the inner signal becomes coherent, the surrounding space either harmonizes or resists, and interference always exploits resistance. This is why some people feel clear during the day, but restless at night, or calm outside, but uneasy at home, because identity is anchored, but the environment is not yet aligned. Ancient teachings understood this progression. Clearly, they did not treat protection as a single act, but as layers: first perception, then identity, then space, each layer removing a different access point. Once identity is stable, the next vulnerability is location, because space influences the nervous system subconsciously. Lighting, sound, layout, emotional memory, and unseen patterns all feed into the background state of awareness. If the space remains incoherent, it constantly nudges the system toward reaction without the individual realizing it. This is why long-term stability requires environmental coherence, not just personal discipline. And this is where the third object eventually enters, not as a new belief, but as a natural extension of what is already happening internally. Because once the signal inside You stabilizes. The question becomes whether the space you live in supports that signal or undermines it. Asterisk, most people underestimate how deeply their environment shapes their internal state, because influence does not need attention to be effective. It works quietly in the background through atmosphere, rhythm, and subtle cues that the nervous system absorbs automatically. A space carries emotional residue, memory patterns, and energetic habits formed over time, and when someone begins stabilizing internally, the contrast becomes noticeable because the body can now feel what was previously ignored. This is why restlessness often appears at night, when stimulation drops and awareness increases. The mind quiets, but the space speaks through tension, unease, or shallow sleep. This is not imagination, it is feedback. When identity is anchored, the nervous system becomes more sensitive to incoherence around it, and interference adapts by shifting from direct internal pressure to indirect environmental disruption. Sleep quality declines, dreams become fragmented, and the body remains alert even when tired. This state keeps awareness from fully settling because deep rest restores perception and interference avoids that outcome. Ancient teachings treated space as a living participant in consciousness, not a neutral container. They understood that walls, floors, and objects absorb patterns of emotion, conflict, and repetition, and that these patterns continue broadcasting long after the events that created them ended. This is why some rooms feel heavy without explanation, and others feel calming immediately. It is not aesthetics, it is coherence. When internal stability increases, the environment either harmonizes or resists, and resistance becomes the next pressure point. This is why relying only on internal discipline eventually feels exhausting, because the space constantly nudges the system toward reaction without conscious awareness. This subtle influence is powerful because it bypasses reasoning and works directly on the nervous system, creating background tension that never fully resolves. When identity is stable but the environment is not, the individual feels clear yet drained, focused yet restless, motivated yet fatigued. This contradiction confuses many people, but it is simply misalignment between inner signal and outer field. Ancient practitioners did not ignore this. They addressed it directly by anchoring coherence, not just within the individual, but within the space itself. This is why the third object was introduced, not as a higher-level belief, but as a practical response to a predictable progression. Once perception opens and identity stabilizes, the remaining vulnerability is location, because location determines whether stability can rest or must constantly defend itself, and until the space aligns fully, rest remains. Partial clarity fluctuates and pressure quietly persists. Is not failure, it is sequence, and understanding this sequence is what prevents people from cycling endlessly between insight and exhaustion. Asterisk, when the environment remains misaligned, creates a constant low-level signal that pulls awareness outward even when nothing is happening, and this is why many people describe feeling watched, tense, or unsettled in familiar spaces without any obvious cause. The nervous system is responding to incoherence, not threat, and incoherence demands vigilance. Vigilance prevents deep rest, and without deep rest, perception cannot fully integrate. This is how interference maintains pressure without ever appearing directly. It simply keeps the system from settling completely. Ancient teachings recognized that true protection was not about constant defense, but about creating conditions where defense was no longer necessary. This is why they spoke about sanctuaries rather than fortresses. A sanctuary is not guarded by force, it is guarded by coherence. Nothing hostile can remain there because it cannot synchronize when the space itself broadcasts stability. The body relaxes naturally. Sleep deepens without effort, and awareness restores itself during rest. This is critical because rest is where perception repairs itself and identity integrates quietly without conscious work. Interference understands this, which is why sleep disruption is one of its most consistent strategies. When rest is shallow, clarity becomes temporary, and identity must be constantly reasserted during the day. This creates fatigue, and fatigue weakens attention again, completing the cycle. The environment becomes The amplifier of this loop, not because it is malicious, but because it has not been addressed. Once internal alignment is achieved, the space must be brought into the same coherence, or it will continuously pull against it. This is why people often feel relief when leaving their home, but tension when returning, or clarity outdoors, but restlessness indoors. The space holds unresolved patterns that continue broadcasting regardless of your awareness. Ancient practitioners treated this as a technical issue, not a moral one. They did not blame individuals for environmental incoherence. They simply addressed it directly using methods designed to stabilize space the same way. The first object stabilizes perception, and the second anchors identity. The third object exists to stabilize location, not symbolically, but functionally, and it does so by introducing a pattern. The environment itself can synchronize with. Once this happens, the nervous system no longer needs to stay alert. Rest becomes deep, and restorative dreams reorganize naturally, and the body begins releasing tension it has been holding unconsciously. This is when the individual finally experiences what sustained clarity feels like, not as effort, but as baseline. And this is why the sequence matters: perception, identity, then space. Because addressing space too early does nothing, and addressing it too late prolongs exhaustion. Understanding this progression prevents frustration and prevents the belief that something is wrong when in reality the process is simply incomplete. Asterisk: when the space finally aligns with the internal signal, something fundamental changes. Effort drops away, and stability no longer requires maintenance. This is the moment most people describe as peace, but peace is not an emotion, it is the absence of internal and external resistance. The nervous system stops scanning for threat. Because there is no incoherence to resolve, sleep becomes deep without forcing. Routines, dreams lose their chaotic edge and begin integrating meaning naturally, and the body releases tension it had been holding quietly for years. This is not mystical, it is regulatory. Once the environment broadcasts coherence, the system no longer needs to compensate. Awareness integrates during rest rather than fighting during waking hours, and this is why addressing the environment is not optional for long-term clarity. Without it, identity must constantly reassert itself, and fatigue eventually returns. Ancient teachings did not rush this step because they understood its weight. They treated space as the final stabilizer, the last layer of protection. Because once space is coherent, nothing has leverage left. Perception is clear, identity is anchored, and the environment supports rather than undermines this state. At this point, interference has nowhere to enter, not internally, not emotionally, and not environmentally. This is when protection becomes effortless, not because you are constantly defending, but because there is nothing left to defend against. And this is where the third object finally becomes relevant, not as a new belief, not as a ritual, but as a practical method for anchoring coherence into the space itself, so that the stability you have built internally can finally rest without resistance. This is why the teachings were never meant to be rushed, because protection is not something you activate once and forget. It is something you establish layer by layer until nothing has leverage left. First, perception returns, so you can see clearly. Then identity stabilizes so clarity does not collapse under pressure. And finally, the space aligns so stability can rest without resistance. When these three layers are in place, life feels quieter, not empty, but ordered. Decisions feel lighter, not because they are easier, but because they are no longer contested. Internally, rest becomes restorative rather than shallow, and awareness stops cycling between insight and exhaustion. This is what most people have been searching for without knowing it. Not power, not control, but coherence. The reason these methods were buried was never because they were complex, it was because they were simple, and simplicity removes dependence. Once you understand this, you no longer chase protection through endless techniques, rituals, or emotional effort. You begin choosing alignment instead, and alignment does the work automatically. This is why you do not need to apply everything at once. You start where the pressure is greatest. If clarity has been missing, you restore perception First, if doubt and hesitation dominate you, anchor identity first. If restlessness and heaviness live in your environment, you align the space first. One layer begins the process, but all three complete it, and once completed, protection no longer feels like something you are doing, it feels like something that is simply present. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on which layer you are currently working through and acknowledge it silently. Awareness itself is already part of the alignment, and if you feel called to continue this journey, stay connected because deeper integrations build naturally on this foundation and are only meaningful once coherence is established. And before you move on, share this with someone who has been feeling drained, confused, or restless without understanding why. Sometimes the greatest help we can offer is not advice, but recognition, and recognition opens the door to alignment. Asterisk, as you come to the end of this message, remember that nothing you have heard requires belief, effort, or struggle. It only requires honesty with your own experience. Clarity returns naturally when interference no longer has access. Identity stabilizes when you stop negotiating who you are, and peace settles when your environment supports rather than drains you. This is not something reserved for a few. It is the natural state that emerges when coherence is restored layer by layer. If you felt yourself reflected at any point in this message, that recognition matters, because recognition is the first sign that alignment has already begun. Take a moment now and notice which layer spoke to you most: perception, identity, or space, and acknowledge it quietly. That awareness alone shifts the process forward. If this message resonated with you, I invite you to share in the comments which layer you are currently working through, not to explain, not to justify, simply to declare it. And if you want to continue exploring these deeper integrations and understand how coherence expands naturally beyond this foundation, stay connected, because what comes next only makes sense once this base is established. And if someone in your life has been feeling drained, restless, or confused without knowing why, consider sharing this message with them. Sometimes clarity arrives not through answers, but through recognition, and recognition opens the door to alignment. Asterisk, and as this message settles, allow yourself to release the urgency to do anything immediately. There is nothing to fix, nothing to force, and nothing to prove. Coherence does not arrive through action, it arrives through allowance. When the system recognizes safety, stability, and alignment, it reorganizes on its own, in its own timing. Trust that whatever layer you are moving through is unfolding exactly as it should, and that awareness itself is already participation. You do not need to understand every mechanism for the effects to continue. You only need to remain attentive to what feels quieter, clearer, and more grounded than before. If you noticed even a small shift while listening, that matters, because subtle changes are the beginning of lasting ones. Let this be something you carry lightly into your day, not as a concept, but as a felt sense of order returning. And if you feel drawn back to this space again, know that each time you listen with awareness, integration deepens naturally, without effort. Thank you for being present for this reflection, and for allowing the process to complete itself quietly and fully. Asterisk, as this closing moment unfolds, let yourself remain still for a few breaths, without expectation or analysis, simply noticing the absence of pressure where there once was tension, and allowing that absence to exist without filling it. Coherence often feels unfamiliar at first because it does not demand attention. It does not push, it does not persuade, it simply remains. And that remaining is what restores balance over time. Carry this state forward gently into whatever comes next, not as something you must maintain, but as something that will maintain itself when left undisturbed. If questions arise, let them pass. If emotions surface, let them move through without resistance. Everything needed for integration is already in motion, and nothing more is required from you. Now, thank you for staying present through this entire journey and allowing the process to reach its natural completion, quietly, steadily, and fully. Asterisk, if this message resonated with you, take a moment to share in the comments which layers spoke to you most: perception, identity, or space. There is no need to explain, simply naming it is enough. And if you feel drawn to continue exploring this path of clarity and coherence, stay connected here, because the next messages build naturally from this foundation and arrive only when the system is ready. Sometimes the most powerful step is not action, but acknowledgement, and your presence here already marks the beginning